Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. Jewel Box.
As an antiques collector, I have always been fascinated by the stories behind objects. About a year ago, during a visit to a small estate sale, I came across an old music box. It was hidden among mountains of unwanted objects, but it immediately captured my attention. Made of exquisitely carved wood, decorated with delicate floral patterns and a small brass handle, it had a singular charm that intrigued me deeply. The elderly lady managing the sale seemed relieved when I picked up the antique music box. She sold it for a symbolic price, muttering something I could barely understand at the time. Her eyes had a shadow of uneasiness, as if she was relieved to be free of it. I ignored the strange forebodings and took the box home. It felt heavier than I expected, and its floral carvings were more detailed up close. I was eager to add it to my collection, couldn't wait to wind it up and hear its unique melody. First signs. That night, I decided to wind up the box and listen to its melody. The music was beautiful, a kind of lullaby that, at the same time, gave you goosebumps. As the melody played, I noticed something strange, a faint, barely audible whisper beneath the music. It seemed to echo softly, as if someone was trying to make themselves heard over the soft notes of the snare drum. At first, I thought it was just my imagination tired after a long day at work. I decided to ignore it and went asleep, hoping it was just a fleeting moment of awkwardness. In the following nights, strange things began to happen. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the music box playing by itself, the lid open and the ballerina spinning to the chilling melody. Living alone, he knew that no one could have roped him in. Desperate, I looked for the origin of the box. I discovered that it had belonged to a little girl named Emily, who had tragically died in a fire over a century ago. The box was the only object that had survived, passing from generation to generation until it was sold as an estate. Final confrontation. I tried to calm any spirits attached to the box, but the manifestations continued. In a last-ditch effort, I took the box to the place where Emily had died and buried it, praying for her peace.
Stars.
Stargazing has been my solace for as long as I can remember. Whether I was at home, in a hotel room, or even lingering in a cemetery, I would always find a moment to gaze up at the night sky. It wasn't just about finding stars. It was about finding a sense of peace and wonder that grounded me. The vastness above felt like a constant companion, offering solace in times of joy and solace in moments of sorrow. But everything changed last week. I can't recall what I did leading up to that moment, or even where I was. I remember standing outside, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, eagerly awaiting the first twinkling stars. That's when I noticed something peculiar. A glow on the horizon that seemed too bright for the setting sun. At first, I brushed it off as a trick of the light, but a creeping unease settled in, hinting at an unsettling disturbance in my familiar stargazing routine. It was a fateful night, much like any other I had spent under the stars. I remember the familiar routine of anticipation as dusk settled and the first stars began to emerge. I stood there, craning my neck upwards, eagerly awaiting that first glimmer of celestial beauty. But then, something caught my eye. A glow on the horizon that seemed out of place. At first, I mistook it for the sun setting again, lingering in an unusual way. Yet, as I stared longer, I realized this was no ordinary sunset. The glow intensified, casting an eerie light that stretched across the sky. Approaching cautiously, I felt the warmth grow on my face. A heat that shouldn't have been there at this hour. It wasn't just light. It was a presence, drawing me closer with an inexplicable pull. The air around me seemed charged with anticipation, as if the night itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. As I approached the glowing light, everything around me seemed to blur into a whirlwind of surreal images and colors. It was as if I had stepped into a dreamlike realm where reality and fantasy intertwined. Faces and places flashed before my eyes, scenes of a world that seemed both familiar and yet utterly strange. The pull towards the light was undeniable, an irresistible force that tugged at my very being. I tried to resist, to step back from the overwhelming allure. but it was as if my movements were no longer my own. Each step towards the light felt heavier, yet propelled by a curiosity that bordered on compulsion. And then, just as I felt myself reaching the pinnacle of that inexplicable attraction, everything went dark. It was as if the world around me ceased to exist, swallowed by an engulfing void that erased all sense of time and space. My consciousness slipped away, leaving me adrift in an abyss of uncertainty and fear. I woke up in a cold, sterile room that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Blinking against the harsh light, I struggled to make sense of my surroundings. It took a moment for realization to sink in. I was in a police station. Confusion washed over me like a tidal wave as I tried to piece together what had happened. The officers informed me that I had been missing for 6 days and 16 hours. My mind raced with unanswered questions, but the only clue lay painfully etched into my skin. The numbers 211-14-15 burned into my back. It was a cryptic message, its meaning eluding me like a shadow in the night. As I left the station, a lingering fear gripped my every step. It wasn't just the aftermath of my inexplicable disappearance. It was a palpable sense of being watched by an unseen presence. Paranoia gnawed at my thoughts, whispering that something beyond comprehension was observing my every move, waiting in the shadows. I can't bring myself to look at the sky anymore. The fear of seeing that blinding light again haunts my every waking moment. What if it comes back? What if it tries to pull me in once more? These questions torment me, keeping me trapped in a perpetual state of vigilance. Sleep has become a distant memory. Night after night, I lie awake, gripped by relentless nightmares. Shadows dance around me, whispering secrets I can't comprehend. I feel their eyes on me, watching from the unseen corners of my room. The paranoia is suffocating, consuming my thoughts until I'm left trembling in the darkness. And then there are the numbers, 211-14-15. They echo in my mind like a haunting refrain, a puzzle I can't solve. What do they mean? Why were they seared into my flesh? Each repetition sends a shiver down my spine, a reminder of the inexplicable events that have forever altered my existence. The stars, once my companions in the vast expanse above, are gone now. Their absence weighs heavily on me, a void in the sky that mirrors the emptiness within. Whatever I encountered that night has left its mark, a chilling testament to the mysteries that lurk beyond our understanding.
Spiritual guides.
I grew up with my older sister near our grandmother's house, which was just a few doors down from ours. Our parents were rarely around due to their busy work schedules and constant travel, so we spent most of our time at Grandma's place. She was more than just a grandmother to us. She was our caregiver, our parent in every way that mattered. Grandma did everything a parent would do. She sent us to school, packed our lunches, attended parent-teacher conferences, and always had a warm meal waiting for us at home. We owed so much to her, and as she grew older and slowed down, my sister and I took on the responsibility of looking after her. We bought her groceries, finished paying off her mortgage, and took her to her appointments. She loved us dearly because one of us was always around to keep her company. One day, I stopped by Grandma's house before heading to work and saw her sitting on the front porch, petting a cat with a white spot just below its neck. "Look, Bobby, I made a new friend," she said with a gentle smile as she stroked the cat's fur. It was strange because I knew all the neighborhood cats and had never seen this one before. She had a new companion, and that was all I cared about. There was no harm in having a pet to keep her company. She fed it, cleaned its litter, and brushed its silky black fur. He was a calm little guy and never left Grandma's side. He became a good companion for her. One night, things took a dark turn. I had just finished work and was heading to Grandma's because I had forgotten my keys at work. I remembered my sister had an extra set and she was at Grandma's house, so I went there. As I turned the corner of her street, I saw her walking along the sidewalk with a cat by her side, moving slowly. "Hey, Grandma, where are you two going?" called out. She smiled at me, taking small steps. "I'll be fine, Bobby. Don't worry." She placed her hand on my arm and continued walking, which felt strange. "Okay, I'll be back soon. I need to get my keys from Casey. Don't go too far, okay?" She waved at me, and the cat moved ahead of her as I headed to the house. When I walked up the steps and opened the screen door, a sense of loneliness hit my heart. I turned the corner and saw my sister Casey crying on her knees, and there was Grandma, sitting with her hands in her lap and her head resting on her favorite chair. I thought to myself, what the hell? How did she get here so quickly? I quickly ran back outside, jumped onto the sidewalk, and saw the same cat, sitting there staring at me, just for a second before it walked away. I went back inside, trying to piece together what I had just seen, and began to comfort my sister, who was quietly sobbing, holding Grandma's hand. I had heard stories about spirit guides coming to people who were about to die. Grandma always talked about them, and a part of me knew she understood what that cat was. It was her spirit guide, leading her to the afterlife. And I never saw the same cat around the neighborhood again. Never again.
Visions.
It all started on a seemingly ordinary morning. I woke up, had my breakfast, and headed to school just like any other day. As I walked down the street, I noticed something strange. When I passed by a man, his face appeared horribly disfigured. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it must be a trick of the light or my imagination. When I looked again, he seemed normal, confused and a bit scared. I continued on my way, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Later that day, during lunch break at school, I overheard some classmates talking about a terrible accident that had happened that morning. Curious, I grabbed a newspaper and felt my blood run cold. The man I had seen with the disfigured face was on the front page. He had died in a car crash shortly after I saw him. My mind raced. Had I somehow predicted his death? It couldn't be a coincidence. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I must have been mistaken, but the fear gnawed at me, refusing to let go. On my way home from school, I encountered an elderly woman. Her face was grotesquely distorted, as if something had eaten away at it from the inside. The same paralyzing terror gripped me. I could barely breathe as I walked past her. When I got home, I couldn't focus on anything. I sat in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. The evening news came on, and my stomach churned when I saw the report of an elderly woman who had been hit by a bus. It was the same woman I had seen earlier that day with the disfigured face. Fear consumed me. I realized this was no coincidence. I was seeing something supernatural, something horrifying. People whose faces I saw disfigured were destined to die tragically. I didn't know what to do or how to cope with this new reality. All I knew was that my life would never be the same again. As the days passed, the pattern became unmistakable. Every day, I would see people with horrifically disfigured faces, and later, I would learn of their deaths in the news. It was as if I had been cursed with the ability to foresee their fates. The first few times, I tried to convince myself it was just coincidence, but the evidence was undeniable. Each new vision brought another tragic story. A man with a mangled face who later died in a construction accident. A young woman whose features were twisted in agony before she was found drowned in the river. Each encounter filled me with a sense of dread and helplessness. I became obsessed, desperately trying to understand what was happening to me. I scoured the internet for any clue, any explanation that could make sense of this nightmare. But nothing I found offered any solace. Instead, I only felt more isolated and terrified. Every time I stepped outside, I was on edge, scanning every face I saw. The disfigured ones stood out like beacons of doom, and I dreaded what would come next. I tried avoiding them, changing my route, staying home as much as possible, but it didn't matter. The visions came anyway, unbidden and relentless. I couldn't sleep. The images haunted my dreams, turning them into a macabre slideshow of death and despair. I withdrew from my friends and family, too afraid to tell them what was happening. Who would believe me? They would think I was insane, or worse, that I was somehow causing these deaths. As the visions continued, my fear grew into a paralyzing despair. I felt powerless, a mere spectator to a series of tragic events I couldn't prevent. Each death weighed heavily on my conscience, even though I knew I wasn't to blame. The guilt gnawed at me, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I was trapped in a never-ending cycle of horror, each day worse than the last. The more I saw, the more I felt like a part of me was dying with each person. My life had become a waking nightmare, and there seemed to be no escape. One day, as I was walking home from school, I saw someone familiar up ahead. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was my aunt, one of the few people who had always been there for me. But as I drew closer, my relief turned to horror. Her face was disfigured, twisted into a grotesque mask of pain and suffering. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head in denial. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. I rushed over, my mind racing with desperate thoughts. I had to save her. I had to stop this from happening. "Auntie, you have to come with me," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "There's something important I need to talk to you about." She looked at me, concerned but unaware of the terror gripping me. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked gently. "Please, just trust me," I pleaded, grabbing her hand and pulling her away from the busy street. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I had to keep her safe, away from whatever fate awaited her. I spent the rest of the day with her, making up excuses to keep her close. I couldn't let her out of my sight. I thought if I could just keep her away from danger, maybe I could break the curse. But the fear gnawed at me, relentless and unforgiving. As the hours passed, I grew more desperate. I checked the news obsessively, praying there would be no report of an accident involving her. But when night fell, my worst fear was realized. The news reported a terrible car accident involving a woman matching my aunt's description. "No, no, no." I screamed, tears streaming down my face. I ran to her house, hoping it was a mistake, that she would be there, safe and sound. But the police cars and ambulance parked outside told me otherwise. I pushed through the crowd, barely hearing the officers' questions as I made my way to the scene. There she was, lying on the ground, her body lifeless and broken. The same grotesque distortion that I had seen earlier was now a grim reality. I collapsed beside her, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, feeling the weight of my failure crush me. Despite all my efforts, I couldn't save her. The curse had claimed another victim, and I was powerless to stop it. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a cold emptiness settle over me. My aunt was gone, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. The visions were relentless, and I was helpless against them. The despair that had been growing inside me now felt insurmountable, and I wondered how much more I could endure. After my aunt's death, something inside me broke. I was filled with grief and guilt, and for a while, I couldn't bring myself to face the world. But life, as cruel as it can be, goes on. I had to go back to school, back to my routine, back to the streets where the visions haunted me. At first, each new vision struck me with the same paralyzing fear and desperation I had felt from the beginning. But gradually, I began to numb. It was as if my mind, in a twisted act of self-preservation, started to accept the horrors as a part of my daily existence. The faces of the doomed became a grim background to my life. I saw a man with a crushed face and knew I would read about a construction accident the next day. I saw a young girl whose face was burned and knew there would be a fire. Each time, I would flinch, my stomach churning, but I would carry on. What else could I do? I couldn't save them. I had tried, and I had failed. The deaths were inevitable, and I was powerless to change that. I stopped trying to warn people. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? "Excuse me, but I see your face is disfigured, and I think you're going to die soon." No one would believe me, and even if they did, what good would it do? The curse was relentless, and the visions always came true. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. I walked through life with a heavy heart, weighed down by the knowledge of what was to come. The faces of the doomed were like a silent procession of ghosts, each one a reminder of my helplessness. I withdrew from friends and family, isolating myself to avoid the pain of losing someone else. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing another loved one with a disfigured face, knowing their fate was sealed. I built walls around myself, both physical and emotional, trying to keep the horror at bay. Yet, despite my isolation, the visions continued. Each day was a new torment, a new reminder of the darkness that had taken over my life. But I no longer fought against it. I accepted it as my reality, a cursed gift I had to endure. The acceptance didn't bring peace, only a dull, aching sorrow that became my constant companion. I carried on with my life, going through the motions, but the weight of the visions never left me. They were a part of me now, a shadow I couldn't escape. In the end, I learned to live with the anguish, accepting the inevitability of the deaths I foresaw. The fear and desperation had dulled into a resigned sadness. I was a spectator to a macabre play, unable to change the script or save the actors. All I could do was watch and wait, bearing witness to the tragedies that unfolded before me. One day, I stepped outside and noticed something different. As I walked through the familiar streets, I realized that none of the faces around me were disfigured. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw normal, healthy faces. My heart began to race, but this time with hope instead of dread. Could it be? Could the curse have lifted? Was it possible that no one would die today? Or had my dreadful power finally disappeared? The thought filled me with an overwhelming sense of joy. I felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I could finally breathe freely again. A smile spread across my face as I walked, and I couldn't contain my happiness. I felt a wave of relief and exhilaration wash over me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that things might actually be okay. I laughed out loud, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in so long. People around me looked up, surprised by my sudden outburst, but I didn't care. I was free from the constant dread and despair. I felt like shouting to the world that I was no longer haunted by the visions of death. But in that moment of pure joy, fate had one last cruel twist in store for me. As I walked past a construction site, I heard a sudden, terrifying crack. Before I could react, the scaffolding from the building above came crashing down. I barely had time to register what was happening before the world went dark. In an instant, my life was snuffed out. The weight of the scaffolding crushed me, ending my brief moment of happiness and my life in one swift, brutal stroke. The last thing I felt was a cruel irony. Just when I thought I had escaped the curse, it found a way to claim me. My own story ended just like those I had witnessed for so long. Suddenly, tragically, and with no way to change the outcome.